Hi everyone. This is going to be just a quick video lecture about some things in chapter 7. Again, I won't be able to hit on all of these things, but I'll try and um, talk a little bit about some of the things I think are important. This chapter is about thought, language, and intelligence. You could probably have a whole class on each one of those topics. So um, in terms of the thought part of this chapter, this is a definition you'll want to know. Thinking is the manipulation of mental representations. So when we have things in our mind, thinking is when we are doing things with the things in our mind. Um, and so that's the definition you're going to want to know, at least in terms of what we're going to define as thinking. And I'm not going to talk about this slide, but there's some things you'll want to know on here, like what's a formal concept, what's a script. You'll want to know about those. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the thinking strategies we use. Uh, Sometimes we use what's called formal reasoning or logic. This is where we think something through. We follow the steps of the problem and the solution to arrive at an answer. And it's a process that we're doing on purpose. We're really thinking about it. But for a lot of things, we use informal reasoning or these things called heuristics, which is essentially a mental shortcut. Okay. And a lot of times these really help us out, but sometimes they can cause problems. Sorry about that. That's not what I wanted to do. Um, so some of the potentially problematic heuristics that we use, one is called the anchoring bias. This is where we form an opinion based on an early piece of information, and then even when we get new information later, we don't change our opinion. Okay, so the classic example of this is first impressions. What we know from research is that first impressions are very long lasting. And if we meet somebody and for some reason they're having a bad day and our first impression of them is they're a really big jerk. Uh, so that's our first impression. And then later we see them and they're not really being a jerk, they're being okay. But we're much more likely to think, well, yeah, that person's a jerk. They're being okay today, but I know that they're a jerk. We get anchored to that first piece of information. Okay, so that's a problem sometimes. Another heuristic your book talks about is the representativeness heuristic. This is where you maybe see someone who looks like they belong to a certain group, and then because you think that, you assign all of the group's characteristics to the person. Okay, so your book, I think, has an example where it talks about it has like two descriptions of two different college students. One sounds like a super computer nerd. One sounds like someone who's interested in psychology. And the question is, well, what major does each person go into? And the one that sounds like a computer nerd, you're likely to think, oh, they're going to go into computer science or something because they like all these things. But statistically, we know there's more psychology majors than anything else in the US. So it's between the two of them, they're both more likely to be psychology majors than anything else. Okay. And then the availability heuristic is one I really like. This is where you're forming opinions on the information that is most available. So last year, if you paid attention to the news at all, you might have thought we were all going to die from Ebola. Okay. Remember how that was just on the news forever? I think this was in like summer 2014 or something like that. Ebola was coming. We were all going to get it. It was an absolute catastrophe. Um, and then it just kind of disappeared, right? Well, we all were scared about it because that's all the news would talk about. But they weren't spending their time talking about how many people were killed in car accidents that day, which is a number that would have been way higher than the amount of people killed by Ebola. They didn't talk about how many people died from heart disease, which would have been a number way higher than the number of people hurt by Ebola. But since that information was readily available, we probably as a society got more scared about that than we needed to be. Okay, so that's an availability heuristic. I'm just going to pause here a minute and go through my slides and see what I want to talk about next. Okay, I'm going to spend just a couple minutes here talking about IQ tests, or how we test intelligence. As a psychologist, this is something that I do on a pretty regular basis. People want IQ tests, or they need to have them done for some reason. And so first we need to just talk about what is intelligence. It includes a variety of things. It's our ability to do abstract thinking and reasoning, our ability to solve problems, our ability to acquire knowledge about the world. And there haven't always been IQ tests. It's really something that first started in the early 1900s by a guy named Binet. Okay, that's how you say that, French guy. And so he was thinking, can we identify what French children are going to do poorly in school? And so he came up with all these different small tasks that he would ask kids to do, which was really kind of the first the first model that we still kind of use. Okay, so when I do an IQ test today, it's not the Binet one, it's a different one, but it has all these small tests that we ask people to do that we think are looking at a variety of things. And he had some assumptions that intelligence involved a lot of different things, and he also, the assumption was that children's mental abilities would go up as they got older. So an older child should know more or be better at these tests than a young child. Okay. And so there's still an IQ test around. It's called the Stanford-Binet IQ test, and it's used mostly for children. And so I don't do a lot of work with kids, so I don't use this one very much. But he came up with the kind of formula for an IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient. And what he would take is he would take the person's mental age as measured by his tests. So let's say you were a 10-year-old, but you did really well and you scored like a 15-year-old. So you would take your mental age divided by your actual age, and then you would times that by 100. So if your mental age was 15, you divide that by 10, and then times it by 100. I think something that you'll want to know, well, just real quickly, the test I use is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. In my in-person class, I usually go through parts of that, but I don't have it with me here for this video lecture, so I'm not going to do that. But this is something you're going to want to know. So this is the distribution of IQ scores in the population. You're going to want to know the average IQ score is 100. Okay, I think there's a test question about that. But you can see we have some people way up that are very smart. We have some people way down that are not that smart. And then a lot of people in the middle. One of the things to know about IQ tests is they're not perfect. Okay. As you probably know, there's lots of different kinds of intelligence, and IQ tests are only testing the things that they're looking at. So if you have a type of intelligence or knowledge that's not tested by the IQ test, that's not going to be factored into the results. And one of the major critiques of IQ tests is they're not necessarily culturally sensitive. Okay. And so most of these tests are made by essentially rich white people. Okay, so if you're coming from a background that's different than that, you may not have been exposed to the information that the test is asking for, and your score will be lower. And what's important is that that doesn't necessarily mean that that person is not smart. So here you can see on this graph that, so here's like the normal average. You can see that African Americans and Hispanic Americans on these tests sometimes score a little lower. Asian Americans sometimes score a little higher. And so it's just important to know that tests are not perfect, that they don't always take culture into account. And that's something that I think about a lot when I am doing a test with somebody is this test appropriate, or do I need to use other pieces of information to help form a better picture here? Okay. And I think that's all I'm going to talk about for this lecture. There is other stuff in this PowerPoint that you're going to want to pay attention to and look over. But in terms of the lecture, that's all I'm going to do.